O dabar mes turėsime tikrai įdomų pokalbį ir nuotolinį, tad tikimės, kad technologinių iššūkių nekils. Ir kalbėsimės su fantastikos rašytoju, kurį pristatys ir daugiau apie jį papasakos pats tikiuosi visiems, arba bent jau didžiai daliai pažįstamas Kastytis Zubovas, kuris yra ne tik aktyvus fantastas, tolkinistas ir kaip tik neįvardinti tavęs, Kastyti. Tai prašau, taip sakant, mikrofonas tavo, laukia įdomus pokalbis, o mes tuoj pat jungiamės ir į Zoomo skambutį.
Sveiki. Taigi, kaip Artūras pristatė, netrukus pradėsim pokalbį su rašytoju Charlesu Strossu. Charlesas Strossas yra britų rašytojas, gyvenantis Edinburge, rašo fantastiką, aišku. Ir geriausiai žinomi jo kūriniai yra turbūt dvi fantastinės romanų serijos, romanų ir apsakymų. Laundry Files serija bei Merchant Princess serija. Pirmojoje jungiasi oficinis humoras, Lovecraftiškas kosminis siaubas ir modernios technologijos. Antrojoje irgi turime modernių technologijų, bet daugiau fantasy, magijos bei kelionių po alternatyvias realybės. So, hello, Charlie. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Perfect. And I think we can hear you quite all right as well. So I guess without further ado, let's start with a talk. So, well, looking at your biography, we can see that you started out as a pharmacist initially before soon becoming a software engineer and a technical writer before transitioning to a fully sci-fi writer around 20-something years ago. So how did this earlier career lead to the sci-fi writer career? And was it always obvious for you that you would be a sci-fi writer rather than, say, something of a different genre?
Yes. In fact, being a writer was what I wanted to do all along from about the age of 8 years. Becoming a pharmacist was a very, very weird detour as a result of catastrophically bad school careers advice, which I'm not going to go into in any great detail. Let's just say the requirements for a good pharmacist and for a science fiction writer are the exact opposite. Pharmacists need to have an incredibly attentive memory, absolutely zero imagination about the consequences if they make a dispensing error, and the ability to do a couple of hundred different jobs every single day. Being a writer, you need lots of imagination. The ability to do multiple jobs a day, forget it. I do maybe one job every 3 to 6 months. It's a book. So, I wasn't suited to it. And by the time I was running a small pharmacy in a rundown town in the middle of England, and it was staked out for an armed robbery twice in 1 month, I realized I needed to get out of that. Now, along the way, I had acquired my first word processor. This was in the mid-1980s, and got a bit annoyed that it didn't have a word count feature for the stories and novels I was trying to write. Vanished down a rabbit hole and ended up doing a postgraduate degree, conversion degree into computer science. Came out of university with a newly minted computer science degree in the middle of a recession, where the only job I could get was as a technical author, which I didn't quite lie my way into, but at least I knew how to write and I had the technical background. Fast forward a bit more, I managed to get out of technical writing and into programming via web development. But another recession came along 10 years later in 2000. At the time I was earning when I lost my main developer job, I was earning most of my living fairly rapidly as a freelance computer journalist covering the open source and free software movement. This was when I finally managed to actually sell a novel for the first time. Let's just say you shouldn't give up your day job and try and write your first novel with any expectation of earning a living. The cash flow is terrifying. You get paid years in arrears. But by this point, I had a writing job where I could do small bitty writing, which I could interleave with working on the books. And over the next 5 years, as the magazine industry died as a result of internet advertising, the books took off. I basically lucked out. There's a scene in a James Bond movie where James Bond crosses a river by running from the back of one crocodile onto the next. And I feel that way about my careers before I became a full-time novelist.
Well, that sounds like quite a journey. Carrying on from the topic of being a software developer and technical writer at around the time of the early 2000s and late 90s, when the boom and the first .com crash happened. A few of your early works deal a lot with near future visions and visions relating to technological advances. So I'm talking about the Halting State and Rule 34 series and the Accelerando series of short stories. So some of those stories are actually set at around this time, so in around 2020s or even the 2010s. So how do you feel about how technology has progressed now, and do you still think some of your visions from back then were well, I wouldn't say accurate, but plausible, and how do you think about the technological developments nowadays?
I had a secret weapon up my sleeve when I wrote those books, which is by writing about stuff that's only 10 years in the future, we can make a very good job at predicting 90% of the shape of the future. Back around the year 2005, I came up with a rule of thumb, which I've had to change since then, which I'll get into shortly. If you go out on the street now, most of the houses you see have been there for decades. And those houses and apartments and buildings will still be there in several decades' time. There'll be a few new ones added and a few old ones will be demolished, but the architecture is similar. Again, 10 years from now, about half the vehicles on the road will still be there. There will be new vehicles. We can predict a shift to a lot of electric vehicles and a lot of older ones will be retired, but it'll still be generally familiar. Of the people out there, if our average life expectancy is 80 years, well, again, all but about 15% of us will have died. The children will have grown up and be young adults, and there'll be new children, but it'll be largely the same society. So about 70% of the existing infrastructure is already here, if you're looking 10 years out. Of the other 30%, 2/3 of that is stuff that's predictable. When I wrote Rule 34 and Halting State, I was looking at technology roadmaps for the development of semiconductors and smartphones. For the past 50 years, the semiconductor industry, which determines the performance of our computers, has been dominated by Moore's law, which says that as you increase the resolution of the lithography processes used to build chip masks, every time you double the resolution or halve the size of the features on a chip, you square the number of components you can cram onto the chip. So progress follows pretty much an exponential path. We are hitting the end of that curve soon as our circuit density approaches the atomic level, but it's very, very easy to extrapolate forward. So I was able to predict roughly where smartphones would be going in roughly the right time frame. Some things I got wrong by being over-optimistic. For example, virtual reality glasses everywhere by 2017 in halting state. But prototype virtual reality glasses go back to the late 1990s. We have Facebook trying to push them on everybody now. Google tested some 5 years ago. So, you know, I was in the right ballpark. Similarly with self-driving vehicles, I was perhaps a little optimistic, but not wildly so. The real problem I run into is what I call the WTF factor. There is stuff you simply cannot predict from 10 years in the past. I'm in the UK in 2021. COVID-19, which is why I'm not standing in front of you in person right now, because I would love to be at Lituanicon in person. COVID-19 was not predicted as such, but something like it was going to happen sooner or later. It's our third encounter with a SARS-type coronavirus. It's the one that went pandemic after we successfully contained MERS and SARS-1. It's been fairly obvious we'd have a viral pandemic for ages, so that could easily have factored in, but the precise effects it's had on us were unpredictable. I had no idea that the anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers would be crawling out of a woodwork, or that it would be such a storm on social media. Additionally, I'm in the UK. 10 years ago, Brexit was not on anybody's radar. It was a minority obsession of a small group of marginalized conservative members of parliament. Over the following 5 years, it turned into a firestorm that swept over British politics and changed it out of all recognition. Again, nobody actually expected Donald Trump as US president. The possibility for a Trump was already there, but nobody anticipated him. I mean, he was actually the punchline to a joke in several comedy shows about Donald Trump as president as recently as 2010. You know, he was just totally implausible. So a chunk of our lived reality is very predictable. Another chunk of it can be extrapolated very clearly from existing blueprints, and perhaps 10% of it is utterly wild stuff that, you know, you roll the dice and come up with something crazy. Now, that was how it looked back in 2005. My rule for it these days is about 60% of it is already here, the infrastructure, because existing infrastructure is going to be increasingly degraded by climate change, as we saw with, for example, floods in Germany, in Central Europe, and firestorms in California and Australia. Again, about 20% of the tech is relatively predictable. Moore's law is continuing, although at a slower pace. But now we are up to about 20% of stuff that is utterly unpredictable. Again, I mean, go back 10 years, who actually predicted that by 2021, Elon Musk would be about to fly a reusable spaceship bigger than a Saturn V? Or that NASA would have contracted with him for several $1 billion to build a version as a moon lander for 2024, able to take 100 astronauts to the surface of the moon. I mean, that's just crazy stuff. It fell out of a Heinlein novel.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it does seem like we're kind of living in a sci-fi novel, which isn't all that bad as long as it doesn't turn out to be a dystopic one.
I think it has. It's very dystopic. In fact, we're living in the backstory of a bad 1970s analog story at times. It's just, sorry, I'll stop interrupting.
Right. I'd like to remind our audience that if you have any questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and I will let you ask those questions. But first, let's have one more question from me. So moving on a bit to the way you write and to your creative process. Now, in one of our earlier email chats, you mentioned that, well, the secret to the process is that there is no process, but perhaps there is something in common to how you write your books.
Okay, I'm constrained a little bit because I am currently juggling two gigantic multi-book series. each of which have their own world-building story arc and characters, and which are kind of crushing me because there is, to some extent, a method for writing books in these series. You know, you continue more. It's like writing another chapter of an existing novel. But when it comes to writing new material or other stuff, the only rule I can think of is that I try not to do the same thing twice. There are some genres in which formula writing is the norm. For example, what is sometimes called a cozy detective mystery. There is a village, somebody in the village has been murdered. An amateur detective comes in and tries to identify the murderer before the police can find them and arrest the wrong person. This is a formula. You can change the names, modify some of the character details, but you've basically written the same novel over again. There are subgenres within romance that are similarly easily stereotyped. Now, you can also have the same sort of formulaic writing within science fiction. But as with all the genres, you can break the walls and try to invent new stuff. I don't think it's useful to just keep repeating the same old story time and again. So I'm always looking for something new I can do. And the starting point is a set of questions about the world, or the world the story will be set in, and some characters who you have to have ideas for, and see how the characters react to the world and how they act on the world in turn. I'm trying to come up with an example here, but it's actually been some years since I last tried to write something that wasn't part of the gigantic Merchant Princes series, or the Laundry Files and its new spin-off series, The Tales of the New Management. These are both over 1 million words of fiction. There is another project I have that I can mention, which is a space opera. It's incomplete because I had to shelve it in 2017 when my father became ill and died. And I couldn't face working on it until both my parents were out of the picture. But that's actually my next job after I finish the current Laundry Universe novel. The inspiration for that story was very, very simple. I was really annoyed with the way the Who Ordered That side of history was throwing stuff at me. I wanted to go back to writing science fiction that Donald Trump could not disrupt. So I set it 2/3 of a million years in the future. Our species has only been around for about 1/3 of a million years. So 2/3 of a million years is an unimaginable distance from now. That remove in time, our species will probably be extinct. We may be remembered as the last common hominid ancestor before hominid evolution continued. It is, of course, an interstellar story, in fact, intergalactic. There are a myriad of inhabited planets, and they're inhabited by a wide range of human-descended species who we would recognize as our cousins if we saw them, just as we would recognize Neanderthals as human adjacent. At that remove, a flint hand axe and a Soyuz capsule are of identical antiquity. At that remove, science as we know it is over. Anything that we can learn about, anything that we can deduce about the universe or experimentally explore will have been explored by then, or it will be a matter of stamp collecting. You know, there's another supernova over there. Let's log the coordinates and the details of it and add to the list. Consequently, the attitude to science in general will be very, very medieval. It will be, if you want to know about something, you consult the librarians and the scholars because it will have been encountered before at some point in the past 500,000 years. And there are a lot of other weird consequences that go into designing a universe around that premise, where the basic premise is simply 2/3 of a million years. Actually, I could spend this entire interview talking about the world building for this one novel called Ghost Engine, but I don't think that would be fun for you, as it's not going to come out before 2024 at the earliest, because I haven't finished rewriting it yet. So back to you.
Okay, so we had at least one question from the audience. So, okay, if you could ask the question. You can ask it in Lithuanian and I'll translate if needed.
I can ask it in English. First of all, thank you very much for sharing so far. It was super interesting to follow. One question. So which science fiction authors do you believe are criminally underappreciated and underrated?
Ooh, that's a very open-ended question because we only know authors by their past history of what they've been doing, stuff they've already done. I will say that for several decades, I tracked Bruce Sterling as pretty much an object of emulation. He's currently living in Italy and writing more weird stuff on an intermittent basis. But during the late 1980s to early 2000s, he was consistently asking questions 5 to 10 years before anybody else in the field. There was his novel Islands in the Net from 1987, examining the consequences for a global internet-enabled world and what it might look like. Holy Fire from 1994 examined a post-plague medical gerontocracy with life prolongation medication as a result of the biological sciences developed to protect humanity from emergent plagues. Heavy Weather from, I think, 1989 or 1990 examined the consequences of climate change, the political gridlock we've seen and the chaos we've seen in, for example, the United States. He examined in 1998's Distraction. I could just keep going. He was consistently examining questions 10 or 20 years ahead of the pack. He more or less invented the new space opera single-handed in 1987 with Schismatrix, and then he walked away from it after the one novel. So there is one criminally underrated author. But the problem is the question of how well authors are known varies geographically as well. Currently, my understanding is that the biggest written science fiction market in the world is China. And yet we know very, very few of the Chinese SF writers currently writing, much less the ones who wrote previously. They simply haven't been translated into English, which is not only my only language, but it's the main language for science fiction internationally, simply because American publishing steamrollers everybody else. Sorry, still, you kind of crashed my brain there because I'm not very good at regurgitating lists of names either. My memory doesn't work that way.
Well, I suppose we can move on then, and if you remember something suddenly, you can just start telling us more names. So we have another question from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to ask a question about the possible end of the world. In your books, in Laundry series, you described the Emerald Case Green, Nightmare Case Green, Nightmare Case Yellow, and Nightmare Case Red. And two of those are global technological singularity, or aliens taking over, or, Cthulhu awakening since people think too much. So, in your personal opinion, is humanity actually capable of exploring the stars and going there, or we're probably gonna get one of those three before anything better happens?
Is humanity capable of exploring the stars, or are we going to go extinct first? Well, I don't think humanity can explore the stars on its own, because we are actually just one organism that has emerged and co-evolved with an entire biosphere. 90% of the cells in your body or mine are not actually human cells. They're bacteria and fungi that live in our gut and on our skin. We're carrying kilograms of this other stuff around all the time. And weirdly, if we kill it all off with antibiotics and fungicides, we get sick. And that's just for stuff in our own bodies. We cannot survive in isolation without taking an entire ecosystem with us wherever we go. So a humanity that could colonize the stars is actually really a terrestrial biosphere that could colonize the stars, and that's a much taller order. We don't really know or have much experience with how to build a self-sustaining biosphere that can survive in isolation, never mind in microgravity or a high radiation environment. Also, the stars are a terribly long way away, and there are real huge practical difficulties with interstellar travel in anything relating to a human time frame. If you get to 1% of the speed of light, for example, the interstellar medium isn't empty. It's full of neutral hydrogen atoms and also helium nuclei. And at 1% of the speed of light, those helium nuclei have about the same kinetic energy as alpha particles, radiation. Go a bit faster and you run into beta particles and gamma particles just out of the interstellar medium. And I did some calculations a way back on what the radiation environment for a Slurven-like spaceship would be, and it's absolutely horrifying. Anything over 10% of the speed of light, and you might as well wander naked through the sarcophagus at Chernobyl. That's your metaphor. Only do that for years on end. So I'm not that optimistic about our ability to colonize interstellar space directly. Our first and most immediate obstacle is surviving the coming climate change over the next century, which is already in the process of precipitating the biggest mass extinction since the end of the dinosaurs. And if we will be very lucky and very good indeed if we do not collapse our entire agricultural system and all starve to death, because climate change means crop failures.
So instead of exploring the stars or technological singularity or aliens or Cthulhu, we get climate change. Poor us. We have one more question from the audience. So, go on.
For your big series, The Merchant Princes and Laundry Files, do you have any idea how the series is going to end, the end point? Or is it a mystery to you as much as the characters?
Yes and no. The Merchant Princes was originally planned as a series of 4 gigantic books, about 600 or 700 pages each. But that was in 2002. No series survives contact with editors, the market, fans, or your own self aging 20 years as you work on it. But the last book in it, book 9, as opposed to book 4, is coming out in a couple of weeks. And it more or less sums up the plan from the original series plan back then, which is quite astonishing in its own right. Now, the Laundry Files never had a plan. It was a single short novel I wrote back in 1999. And then they asked me for a sequel novella and then a sequel novel, and it kind of grew. It grew so much that after over 1 million words and nearly 20 years, I ran into the problem that it was getting too close to political satire in the UK, and British politics this decade is beyond satire. So I'm currently on a detour from the Laundry Files, writing the New Management books. The New Management is the government that took over at the end of book 8 of the Laundry Files. Nyarlathotep, the Black Pharaoh, a Lovecraftian elder god, has become the Prime Minister of the UK. He is, of course, Brexiting because he wants to end free movement to prevent the human sacrifices escaping. Anyway, the tales of the New Management are basically about ordinary people rather than spies or civil servants living under this oppressive regime that is building a pyramid of skulls in the centre of London for its own amusement. And at least I can still carry on grappling with that and dealing with issues of autonomy and what it's like to live under a viciously hateful regime. There is absolutely no metaphor and no satire here whatsoever, I assure you.
Okay, thank you. And so if we go, if we think a bit about those huge series, both Merchant Princess and Laundry Files. So if we look at Merchant Princess, in your own words, the series comes on like high fantasy. A female investigative journalist from Boston discovers a locket that allows her to visit another timeline where the eastern seaboard of North America is underdeveloped and occupied by a high medieval civilization, and goes out like a paranoid techno-thriller. What if the post-9/11 US government discovered that the main drug smuggling cartel shipping produce into the USA actually came from a parallel universe? So it is difficult to categorize as either sci-fi or fantasy, and it blends together a lot of genre stereotypes that don't seem to go together often, at least. So how do you manage to make it work, to this kind of blend?
Okay, the first thing you need to know is when I first sold my first two science fiction novels, Singularity Sky and Iron Sunrise, they sold fairly fast, but they sold to Ace, an American publisher, who at the time were publishing one book per author per year. It took 2 years for the first book to come out because they needed to find a gap in their schedule. So 3 years until the second book could come out. Also, the contract that I had signed said, we have an option on your next science fiction novel, meaning I have to send it to them first before I send it to any other publishers. So having handed in the second novel, my agent turned around to me metaphorically in email and said, well, you know, you can't sell a science fiction novel to anybody else for the next 2 years. How about you write me a big fat fantasy series or an alternate history series, which I can sell to somebody else without violating the contract? Which seemed like a good idea. Now, I'm allergic to high fantasy. You will not find me trying to write The Wheel of Time or The Witcher. I just can't. I grew up in a kingdom with a hereditary monarchy. It's not my cup of tea. Don't need to write fantasy about real life. Anyway, my reaction was, okay, alternate history, parallel universes. And I have a couple of rules for that kind of writing. When I'm trying to do something cynically commercial, it is steal from the best and make sure they're the best people who are dead so you're not competing with them. There is no point now in trying to write A Song of Ice and Fire because George R.R. Martin is already out there and he's still doing them. So I looked around and thought, Roger Zelazny, 9 Princes in Amber. He's dead and he's good. Also, H. Beam Piper's Paratime had just been reissued. That was sort of trade and parallel universes. And I thought, let's take the premise of 9 Princes in Amber, strip it right back to the absolute minimal, most basic version, come up with a science fictional premise for it, and then package it as something that can be plausibly marketed as whatever the hell the editor wants to market it as. And that's where the initial structure of the book came from. But as I said, no plan survives contact with the enemy, and by enemy I mean editor. When I handed the first book in to David Hartwell at Tor, he loved it, he edited it, and then he said, okay, we have to publish this as 2 much shorter books, it's too long, you have 1 week to cut it in half. And that's why what was really a science fiction saga about economics and trade between parallel timelines got marketed as skinny fantasy novels.
Right. The thing about your editor and the contract sounds like something lifted straight from a Laundry Files plot. Right. And looking at Laundry Files, you said it started as a single short novel without much of a plan for a series, but again it combines such seemingly distinct and different genre stereotypes as well. Breakthrough bleeding edge technology and Lovecraftian horror and office humor. How did these things merge into the Laundry Files? Okay,
first of all, I made a mistake when I said it started as a short novel. It started as a short story, but it's not part of the Laundry Files. In 1992 to 1996, I was wrestling with a short story I grew up during the Cold War. I remember what it was like to live in cities that were targeted by nuclear weapons and the existential dread. Everybody I know of my age had nightmares about dying in a nuclear war. And trying to work with that, I was trying to write a short story that would sum up what it felt like for people who didn't live through it, people who had been teenagers or younger when the Cold War ended. And I wrote a story called A Colder War, which was essentially a sequel to H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. Set in the present day, the Mountains of Madness were exploited, they were explored. Everybody sent archaeological expeditions there to loot the stuff and to turn it into weapons. Fast forward a bit, and you have the Soviet Union and the United States in the early 1980s pointing Lovecraftian horrors at each other, and then a war starts. And it was a successful story. It's been anthologized many times since, but it was far too bleak and depressing to write any more in that universe. Obviously, the way to deal with that was to defuse it with comedy and humor. I've also always had a yen to write a particular type of British spy thriller that dates to the Cold War, which focuses on office politics and the dismal realities of life with the occasional stabbing, and was focusing on the British writer Len Deighton, who's very famous. He was a bestseller for decades. And it seemed to me that the way to make it work, the way to get comedic effect, was to have the Lovecraftian elements, a British government agency to defend us from magical intrusions, handled by a straightforward civil service secret bureaucracy in the mold of a traditional British spy agency, and then to drop a totally unsuited protagonist into it. Bob is basically a .com1 era geek who's fallen into a Cold War British spy thriller and can't get out. And you can have much fun by bouncing somebody like that off all the bureaucratic apparatus of state security. I should add, all bureaucracies follow much the same principles of organization and design internally. I've worked in everything from small businesses to a .com startup to an American software multinational to the British National Health Service, which is one of the largest employers in the world with millions of staff. And you run into the same weird malfunctions of committee processes and management hierarchy in every different enterprise. So a lot of the stuff in the laundry actually comes from generic management nonsense. Now, it turned out that having a naive and ill-equipped protagonist in this sort of environment makes a good source of humor. And humor is a contrast medium that highlights horror and vice versa. You can get whiplash veering between total nightmarish horror and playing it for laughs. So it seemed to work better that way, and that's the basis I proceeded on. But I discovered this through a process of exploration over a couple of years with the first few laundry books. These days, though, it's become a universe and a setting with a life of its own.
Okay, I think we have another question from the audience. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to jump back to the writing techniques and ask you, do you get writer's block? Do you need inspiration to write, or you just wake up, I don't know, have breakfast, write for 4 hours, and lunch 4 hours, another writing, and that's it? So how does it work for you?
Yes. To expand on that, all of the above. Writer's block first. Writer's block hits me at random, and it's invariably because I've made a mistake and have been writing my way up a dead end and need to stop, go back, think about what I've just done, scrap the past few thousand words and start again. It's my subconscious pulling the brake cable, in other words. However, I do need to stop and refresh myself and find sources of stimulation. It's been particularly hard the past couple of years with lockdown and COVID-19, not being able to travel, experience new things and meet people. I've been pretty much housebound. I have a pre-existing medical condition that before vaccination put me at fairly severe risk if I was infected. I also try to take a sabbatical every decade and usually fail, but taking 6 months off to just do other things when I'm feeling burned out and can't think of any new ideas is the surest way to shake loose a random novel. Writing without any commitment is easier than facing a deadline and a contract saying you will write a novel of X words about subject Y. I'm not sure quite why, but traveling around also helps, gives me new settings, gives me new ideas for where to base stuff. And as for how I write, it depends. Sometimes it is tedious drudgery, pushing a boulder up a hill. And sometimes it isn't. The longest it ever took me to write a novel was 4.5 years for Accelerando. The fastest I ever wrote a novel was, I think, 21 days for The Annihilation Score. I then had to go back and rewrite the last chapter, which took another 21 days, but it worked. Part of the reason for that is because while in both cases the initial vision turned up more or less fully formed, in the case of The Annihilation Score, I came down with a weird condition called hypergraphia, where you can't stop writing. Circumstances had prevented me from writing for 2 months, and then I had an idea, sat down, and it just spewed everywhere. With Accelerando, it got increasingly difficult towards the middle. In fact, it was written as a series of 9 stories, and in the 5th story, at the midpoint of the book, it was so difficult to proceed that I just gave up and wrote the first 200,000 words of The Merchant Princes instead in 10 weeks for light relief, rather than writing a short story. This incidentally is known among writers as hoovering the cat, the activity we engage in so that we're not actually working. I can't write, I'm hoovering the cat.
Right, now I see what you meant when you said that there is no single process for writing a novel. Continuing on a bit with the theme of the writing process, there was a question asked by a young aspiring author about where do good writers find good critique. And that author said that, well, I'm incredibly lucky to have contact with an author whose work I respect and who would be willing to well and truly rip into anything I would send him. But one opinion is hardly enough. So what's the process when you're looking to improve and evolve your work?
I'm not sure any advice I can give will be that useful because I've been writing novels full-time for a living for 20 years. I went through my learning stages 30 to 40 years ago, back before there was an internet, at a time when things were very, very different. I would say the best thing you can do is try and find a local, no, not a local writers group. Locality doesn't matter so much these days, but a writers group where people have a wide range of abilities and they're there to learn how to write and to critique each other's work effectively, not for ego preening. The worst thing to do, I think, is to associate with people who think that author is a lifestyle, not a job. There's an awful lot of people who seem to think that being a writer is some kind of, it's a lifestyle with book signings, signing tours, travel, oh my, and somewhere in the middle work happens. No, for work is the first thing, and you should always be trying to improve your craft. A big warning sign is people who take offense at criticism. As long as it is reasonably constructive criticism, they should be trying to learn from it, not get defensive. Another sign is people who expect positive ego stroking in return for their ego stroking, rather than actually giving an honest opinion. Where to find this these days, I don't know. There's a local writers group in Edinburgh that I'm very loosely connected to, but for most of my work, I have a closed set of beta readers on a social media platform that I'm not going to mention. who I've known for years and who basically pick holes in my work for me in return for the privilege of getting to read my work in rough draft.
Thank you. And okay, so another question, going a bit back to the world building, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit already in your other answers, but so what I'm wondering about is, well, both Merchant Princess and the Laundry Files are set in universes that are at least close to our own, on the surface at least. Well, they are set at roughly our day, and of course there are Lovecraftian horrors lurking in the shadows, so there are parallel universes and drug dealers from parallel universes, but there's still the British bureaucracy, the American government, and so on, and they play a significant role. Do you think writing and world building for such novels and series is easier or harder than for something that's completely separated from the real world? Or in general, how is that different?
It is easier in that you can substitute research for creative world building for a lot of your material. If you rely entirely on world building in an imaginary universe or an imaginary setting, you run the risk of not noticing your own homemade pitfalls and internal contradictions until it's too late. That's why there'll be no more books after Singularity Sky and Iron Sunrise. I made some fundamental mistakes that were going to leak out in the third book if I wrote it. Whereas with the American bureaucracy or the British civil service, I can actually do some research on it or go drinking with civil servants and listen to their anecdotes and complaints about the workplace. There are other areas where you can outsource your world building, as it were. The current book I'm writing, the third of the new management books set in the same universe as The Laundry, is set in 1816. It's effectively the historical Laundry Files book. People keep nagging me for a historical one, so I'm writing the wrong historical, just because. There's a huge body of literature set in the Regency period in England, when Jane Austen was writing, for example. Now, on the one hand, it's quite perilous to write there because it's effectively a giant shared universe populated by fanatical nitpickers. On the other hand, it means there's an awful lot of pre-digested research. So you can dive down endless rabbit holes of trying to find stagecoach timetables from Liverpool to Manchester in 1816, which is something I actually did. And then working out how much you have to tip the security guards who keep you from being ambushed by highwaymen.
Okay, do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, we have one.
So my question would be this: do you miss being a software developer?
No, it drove me mad. The sense of reward you get from working on a large piece of software is comparable to the sensation of writing a novel. These are both very big, intricate mental constructs with lots of meshing parts and the potential for things to clash horribly and go awry. What I really don't miss about the software side was the work environment, because the last time I was working in software and nearly had a nervous breakdown, you got a Celerando out of it, but I was working for a successful.com startup. We were a credit card payment processor who've been absorbed by MasterCard now. I was the first programmer hired 2 weeks before they formed the company. I was reporting to the chief technology officer, and we had a period of 9 months, 9 consecutive months, during which we had 30% monthly compound growth. Now, 30% growth in turnover of a company in 1 year is pretty outrageous and amazing these days. 30% per month, every month, does your brain in. And the code I was writing, which was in live production, even as I kept fixing bugs and improving stuff, was handling real world money. If anything broke, people could lose an awful lot of cash. I'm really glad it wasn't safety critical stuff where lives depended on it, but you know, that sort of pressure is not good.
Okay, and I think we can move on to the last question, which would be this. So you talked a bit about the stuff you're working on now and some of the next couple of novels that we might expect, but do you have any plans for a new series?
Yes and no. First of all, I'm trying to end The Merchant Princes because I'm a type of writer known as a pantser. I don't have a huge book of world building rules. I keep it all in my head. And I'm now in my late 50s. Keeping it all in my head is hard, especially with two of them. I am planning on ending the Laundry Files series about Bob within the next book or two. But I'm spinning off another series in the same universe because I like that universe. That's what the new management books are. So that's not really a new series. It's a different continuation of an existing series. The space opera Ghost Engine is, if it surfaces, I was designing it with the goal in mind of being able to write sequels in the same universe. I was in fact targeting the same sort of feel as the late Ian Banks's culture novels, only without cloning the culture. They would be standalones, but they'd share a setting. That's the nearest I'll commit to saying I'll write a new series. Series works take a very long time, and if I start a new series now, I won't be at the current stage of the launch of a Merchant Princes with it until I'm in my 70s, and that's a big commitment.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time, so thank you very, very much for agreeing to speak to us. And thank you to everyone who listened and asked questions. And Charlie will be appearing in just over an hour in the horror panel discussion in the second hall upstairs. So thank you, and we'll have a chance to chat soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me.